Welcome to The Interviewers, a podcast for experts and influencers with advice and tips for getting booked on podcasts. This show is brought to you by guestexpertsonair.com. Here's your host, Joseph Shinbald.
Welcome to today's episode for guest experts who want to jazz up their marketing with podcast appearances. Our guest today is Léandre Larouche. Our topic for the show is how to become a compelling author and use your book to speak on podcasts. Hello, Léandre.
Hi.
So happy to have you on the show because you're an expert in a field. I think a lot of people who listen to this show, they are not yet in the process of writing a book, and this will be super interesting. So the first thing, of course, I will talk a little bit about the biography of Léandre. So he was born in Quebec. He lived in Canada, England, and the United States. He studied English literature and professional writing at Concordia University. He also studied at the University of Nottingham, England, and he took on a Fulbright fellowship in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. He also served as an interpreter for the United Nations conference. And the most important thing, he has his own podcast called The Word Leader Podcast. Léandre Larouche is a writer, author, coach, consultant, and the founder of Stellar Writing. He has helped hundreds of people with their writing with a method he calls the Trivium method. By the way, he wrote his first novel at age of 21. This episode is really for you if you want to write a book, but feel daunted by the project, if you lack the confidence or the clarity to do it, or if you think that it has to be a very, very long project. So my first question, Léandre, is how do you find your big idea and then how do you position it?
That's a great question. And what I like to tell people, because it can be, you have to look deep down inside yourself, and it can be kind of scary. Now, what I like to advise people, and it's kind of a loaded question, but you have to ask yourself, what's the one thing, what's the one statement that you want to make to the world, or the idea that you want to share with the world, that you are not okay dying without having shared with the world? So I like to imagine if you're about to die and there's one thing that you feel like people should learn from you, one statement, what is it? And the reason I ask the question this way is, as individuals, we have themes, we have ideas, we have thoughts, and they kind of get confused, and sometimes it's not clear which ones matter the most, but there's always one important theme. There's always one important idea that we need to share. And so the process of finding your big idea and positioning it is really about finding that one idea that overarcs every other ones, because not all ideas are created equals, right? And, there are some ideas you have, they kind of support the big statement that you want to make to the world. And there are other ideas that are actually, the statement. And so you want to discern between those types of ideas. But really the starting point is asking yourself, what is it that I want to share with the world, and that I'm not okay dying without having shared this? Now, when it comes to positioning it, my process is really about finding where you stand in the conversation. So I like to think of writing as a conversation that people are having, both authors, readers. People are talking about one thing, and everybody has something to contribute to that conversation. And everybody who contributes something will do it in a different fashion. So you have to find what it is about you, what it is about your background and your experiences that give you a unique angle on the topic that you're talking about. And so that really helps positioning that idea in a way that will be original, that will be compelling for people to
I
read.
think maybe an example. I mean, for every expert or coach or writer, it's not about maybe so urgent to write the book, but it definitely can help a lot to position that person as an expert in the field.
Absolutely. And I would say, if you look at the internal architecture of a book, it's very similar to the internal architecture of marketing and sales. So if you're a coach, a consultant, or if you're a service provider, you go on social media, you promote yourself, you advertise. Well, you need to show something that people need. You need to be solving a problem to which you have a solution. And the marketing and sales process is really about showing your unique angle to the problem. So in copywriting, they call that the unique mechanism, or it could be like your intellectual property. It's your unique system that you bring to the table. And that's very similar to the unique angle that I'm talking about. You know, they're kind of two different realms. There's the realm of, there's the market for coaches, consultants, experts. There's also the book market. Now, these two markets, they're somewhat different, but at the end of the day, they follow the same rules. They follow the same laws. And so you have to figure out what's your unique value. And so by writing a book and by taking the writing process seriously, that helps you with your marketing. Now, the other way around is also true. If you take your marketing and sales seriously, then that also feeds into your book writing process. So the two things are intertwined. And so that's the way that I like to think about it. And if you approach it this way, it will make your writing better, and it will make your marketing and sales better.
It is very subtle. I mean, I think about the original angle. I can write about, let's say I did write a book about meditation, but how many angles can you have about meditation? A lot, of course. If you write about meditation just as a book where it gives an overall overview of the different types of meditation, and then it makes some suggestions how you can get into the habit of meditating. But when I think about this kind of idea to write a book about a subject and then to find the original angle, this is, I think, the part where you easily sweat about it, because you can get that easily wrong, because there is just so much out there. And you are there. It's almost like in the dating world, you know, you go on this dating website and you put your picture there and you say hello. Well, that will not do it. I mean, nobody will be interested in that kind of person unless you have some kind of humor or funny or some in the first 10 seconds or 20 seconds, you can fascinate with something, right? So the same thing is with the book. I mean, you have to have an interesting title. Title is probably the most important thing, because that's what most people read. I would say 99%, the ones who see it. But then when you write the book, then it has to be also a book where you have a compelling reason. So people actually say, I need this book. I need to buy this book because this is what I want. This is that original angle I was looking for. So how do you find that original angle? I think that's really the deep question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm really glad you asked, because, you know, it can be tricky, but it's actually not that hard, because if you really think about it, if you think about even like the history of the world, the history of science, if you think about all the innovations that occurred, most of the time they occurred because somebody took insights from two different fields and put them together, and then something happened and it turned into something entirely different, yes. Right? You know, in science and literature. And so a lot of the experts in a discipline, they actually come from other disciplines because they applied insights from other disciplines. You may be familiar with Jay Abraham, who's a marketing genius. He's very famous for, you know, he's worked in like over 1,000 industries. And so his strength is applying insights from different industries into other ones and making things happen. So the same thing happens for the original angle. The way I look at the world is you have all these domains, you have all these concepts, and there's kind of at a superficial level, there's a finite number of concepts and a finite number of domains in the world that you can look at. And if you start drawing from these domains, you can connect things. So let's say I'm writing about, let's say, politics, and that's a domain. Now, there are other domains that I'm interested in, and so I can draw from these domains and take insights from these and apply them to politics. Doing that creates an original angle. And a lot of the time when we do that, we're the only one who can do it, because as individuals, we are connected to certain domains. We are connected to certain, I call them communities. For example, like I love politics, so I can say I'm part of the quote unquote politics community. I have a lot of friends who love politics and we like to talk about politics. So I'm part of that community. So I have knowledge, I have experiences, I have insights about politics. Now, I can apply those to other domains that I'm knowledgeable about, and doing that will create unique angles. And so the way that you find your unique angle is really like taking a deep look at who you are, what interests you, what you know about, what you've experienced, and looking at which insights you can use and apply to other domains. And by doing that, because if you take an insight in sports and then you try to apply it to politics, and I'm not saying it's going to work all of the time, it might not work, but if it does work, what you've done with that insight, you've created wisdom, because you have made an insight universal. And when something becomes universal, it becomes wisdom. And people are hungry for wisdom. They're hungry for things they can apply in their life, whoever they are and whatever their situation is, or wherever they are in the world. So really the bottom line is connecting ideas from different fields, because literally every idea we have, it's been thought by somebody else at some other point in history, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be writing about it. Maybe right now I'm thinking something that some philosopher thought about in the 17th century, but we're not talking about that idea anymore. And maybe we need to bring back this idea today. So I have a duty to write about it. But not only that, I also have a duty to write it in a way that's compelling to the audience that I want to talk to. And so that leads me to a second point where, the unique angle has to speak to your target audience. And so what I was saying about connecting ideas from different disciplines, you want to do that to the extent that you are connecting ideas from disciplines that your target audience is interested in. And what I like to talk about is the idea of a field of reference. As an individual, I have a field of reference. I have domains that I'm interested in, that I know about. And as societies, for example, if you take Quebec, Quebec has its own field of reference. So if I'm talking to a Quebec audience, then I want to make sure I speak from within the field of reference. The same thing goes for Canada. The same thing goes for the United States. Same thing goes for the Western world. So you have to really figure out who the target audience is, not just demographically, but also in terms of what they're looking for. And then you speak from within their field of reference, and you connect ideas from different places, and that creates a unique angle that your audience is interested in.
Right, I clearly understand. It's you connecting the dots with your audience,
yes,
and you're solving a problem, because otherwise, why would you write a book as an expert? And ultimately, it's always about reference, because if I go somewhere in a coffee shop and I meet some people, new people, and I ask the question, do you like philosophy? They say politely yes, but I find out after 5 minutes they are not really interested in philosophy. You know what? After a few days, they will say this Joseph Schindler talks too much, because they were not really interested in it. So you have to have the reference. And when you define ideas, or define the words and define concepts, then it's always what does it refer to? It's a beautiful thing,
Yeah.
the language and the words is a beautiful thing. We are not born with it, but this linguistic ability, it comes to us. We are acquiring us from society. We study it. We get the skill. Why do we do all this? Well, because we learn through it. We expand our world through it. And we wouldn't be who we are if we wouldn't have learned it. So the book is just another extension of this kind of communication, which should be very relevant. The next question is of course totally related with this, and that is also something people say sometimes. You have to find your voice, you have to find your style, you have to find the inner Shakespeare, so to speak. So how do you do that? How do you find your voice, your style, your writing style? That of course has to do with grammar, with rhetoric. It has to do with logic, but you have to find your own style. Otherwise, you're writing a book and it's not really so authentic. And you want to have a book that is completely authentic,
Yes. And before I get into that, I just want to add something really quickly about the example you gave about philosophy, because I think you alluded to something really interesting, where you said, oh, if I meet people at a coffee shop and I start talking about philosophy, they might say, oh, I'm not really interested, and they might think I talk too much. Now, the interesting thing about writing is, people might not like philosophy, but they still need it. And so if you approach them and you say, I'm going to talk to you about philosophy, well, obviously you're going to alienate them. But if you pick the thing about philosophy that makes a difference in their life and you present them that, then they will be interested. And then you can, without them even knowing, you start talking to them about philosophy. And that's your job as a writer, because your audience knows what they want, but they don't actually know what they need. And that's why you're the expert. And so you kind of need to get them where they are, sell them what they want, and then kind of feed them what they actually need. And in the process of doing that, you change their beliefs and you have them go through a intellectual transformation. So it's a beautiful process. Anyway, that's just what I wanted to add regarding the example, because I think it's absolutely right. You can alienate your readers, but if you go through the writing process and you do it right, then you can sell ideas to people that they didn't even know they wanted or that they needed. And so it's your job. It's like the author has a social responsibility.
Main thing, of course, is to keep their attention, because with the book, because if you have them read 10 pages and then they lose interest, then you would have defeated your purpose. Now, what would you say about this thing, what I asked about the inner voice, finding your inner voice, finding your inner style as a writer, the inner Shakespeare?
Yes. So the first thing I would say is there's a common misconception that we can simply write the way that we speak. I think it's at least like 50% wrong. The way that we want to write as authors, we want to find the sweet spot between the way that we speak and the way that we like to read. So for example, like we all have our favorite writers, and we can't just imitate our favorite writers, but the fact that we enjoy the writing says something about us. So the first step that we want to take is really look at the way that we speak and the way that we write unconsciously. So when we're not paying attention, because we have all kinds of linguistic quirks. There are phrases that we use. There are, turns of phrase that we employ that make us who we are, that are part of our personality. And so we want to pay attention to that. Now, we also want to look at our ideals in terms of writing. Now, when it comes to really finding the voice and nailing it down, there are three aspects, like you mentioned, that are part of the Trivium method. So there's grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And so when I'm talking about grammar, I want to be clear that I'm not talking about, there are all these rules that we need to respect. And, in school we're taught, well, if you don't respect the rules, it's bad and you lose points, or at least that's the case in North America. Now, the way that I think of grammar is just this collection of concepts or patterns that we use and that create rhythm. So I love music, and I look at writing the same way that I look at music. And so if you always use the same types of sentences, that is going to be boring. And if you always, if your sentences are always the same length, it's also going to be boring. So you want to vary, your use of grammar. So like the punctuation, the sentence types, etc. But you also want to, the rhythm, exactly.
That you have a rhythm.
But now the other...
with pauses, very important.
The other thing is, there are certain patterns that give a certain effect. So you have to learn what the effect of certain patterns are, because some patterns will make you sound simple and some will make you sound complex, and you have to reconcile that with your audience as well. Like, what's your audience's level of education? But you can be the type of person who loves long-winded sentences, and if your audience enjoys that, then that's perfectly fine. But the first thing you need to do is be aware of the patterns, be aware of the grammar, and so that you can use it to your advantage. And so the way that I like to think about it, it's like, as much as we need to think outside the box, we need to write inside the box. And what I mean by that is, we need to use the constraints of grammar to be properly understood. But beyond that, we have all the freedom to do whatever we want when it comes to logic and rhetoric. So, convincing people of a point, telling stories, we're absolutely free in that. But I always look at grammar as the container in which we put our ideas, and that helps us create our style. I would say the main problem, the reason a lot of people struggle and can't find their voice, is that, they know grammar from school, but they've never really paid attention to the patterns and the effect that patterns have on readers. And so once you become aware, and that's what I teach my clients, once you become aware of those, you become really powerful. So it's really looking at what the language offers and what grammar makes available to us, and using it to create your style.
Very interesting. Now, I really need to ask you about this Trivium method, because that is something you developed, and it's that method through which you are helping anybody who is interested in coaching with their book. Yeah, the 5 steps basically would be super interesting, particularly the last one, which is for the business audience, those who are experts and who want to write books for business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Trivium method, it comes from the Trivium, obviously, which is a Latin word that describes the 3 lower liberal arts: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And so, according to the Greeks, these are the 3 keys to a classical education. And so these are things that we learn at school. Now, the Trivium method that I developed kind of takes it backward, because what I've noticed, especially working as a writing assistant in university, and I was helping, that's where I helped hundreds of people with their writing. I noticed that the way that writing is taught in school is just not adequate. And it doesn't work for a lot of people, especially people that are more in the sciences, and they're not necessarily interested in writing, but they still need to write. So the way that my Trivium method works is I take it backwards. So we start with rhetoric, then with logic, and then with grammar. And so it's the big idea, and then it's the structure, and then it's the style. And so writing is exactly like maths. If you learn maths and you don't follow the sequence and you miss something, along the way, then it's going to be very difficult to get everything together. So the same thing goes with writing. So the Trivium method is really geared toward helping people fill in the gaps in their writing. And so what I do is I take people all the way back to basics, and I don't assume any prior knowledge about writing, although obviously people do have prior knowledge, but I make sure that I take them back to basics so that they fill in the gaps. And so the Trivium method is made of several different frameworks that make it easy and digestible to understand the internal architecture of writing. And a fun fact is that when I was on my Fulbright fellowship in the United States, I was volunteering at a career center, and I was tutoring adult learners that were looking to get their GED equivalency. So that's equivalency for their high school diploma. And I tested out these frameworks, and these were working great. They made things a lot less complicated than a lot of textbooks make grammar and writing in general. And so these are frameworks that literally anybody can use to get better at writing, to understand better how the language works and how to put words together to make sense and to be compelling to a target audience.
Yes, for instance, when I wrote my book about meditation, it was very helpful to logic, for instance, that I would start out with a mind map, and I would just really name my chapters. So from then on, you just had to go like, ask the question, what, why, when, and all this. But logic is like this when you write a book. But then you speak about rhetoric, and you speak, of course, about other elements. Now, the main thing is the 5 steps you have mentioned in that method. I think there are a few steps we didn't talk about.
Yeah, so we did talk about finding out the big idea. So that has to do with the rhetoric. It's your deep why. It's your story. It's basically why is your message or ideas or expertise significant both to you and to your audience. So that's the first step. Now, the second step is positioning that big idea, and so that we discussed as well. Then we talk about the structure, and that's something that's really important, because it's both the structure of your book, but it's also the structure of how you write your book, because a lot of people write outlines, but they don't necessarily write outlines in the way that they should. And by that, I mean, you have people that are very orderly and you have people that are very chaotic. And, if you stand on either extreme, you are going to have a hard time. And so the best structure you can... Yes, you will stifle your creativity. And if you're too chaotic, then it's going to be all over the place. It's going to be hard to make sense of it. And so you want to find a sweet spot between chaos and order, and have the kind of structure that empowers you, that gets you started, but that also allows you the flexibility to tackle ideas in different ways. So that's something that I go through as well. I think it's one of the most important things, because the structure and the process, they are key in making the endeavor successful and enjoyable. Now, obviously, the fourth step is finding your inner voice, your style, so that we discussed. And then the fifth step is about building the author's business. And when I talk about the author's business, it's really about, launching, promoting, publishing the book. And I think people get really confused about publishing. There's a lot of information out there. It is not as complicated as it sounds. Now, the only challenge is that you have to cut through the noise. And there are a lot of companies these days that want to sell you like a self-publishing package and all of that. Now, that's where people like me come in and help people make good decisions about where they're going to go. But, one thing I would say is publishing can be long and costly, like it can be quick and affordable. It really depends on the person's goal, and it really depends on what is going to be the most effective at the end. And that means that the long and costly way could actually be the most profitable one in the end. But again, it depends on a variety of factors. It depends on the person's audience. It depends on the infrastructure that they already have built around them. And it depends on how, like, what kind of channels they're going to use to distribute and so on. But for somebody, it could be super quick and super affordable. And so there's a variety of ways that people can publish, both self-published and traditional publishing. And so again, it really depends on what their goals are.
So if anybody needs a consulting or needs help, and we all do when we start out with a new project like writing a book, there would be actually a 20 minutes free consultation with you, as I learned from that training I went through before I jumped on this interview now. That training is a 21-minute training to become a compelling author and write the book of your dreams in 16 weeks. There is this URL, which will be in the show notes. And then I will also put in the website of yours, and particularly a wealth of information for people who want to know more about getting resources and learning about how to write a book on your podcast called the Word Leader Podcast. So I think this was very interesting for those who really are daunted by the project or feel a lack of confidence or clarity to do it. And it doesn't have to be a long project at all. So I thank you very much.
Thank you.
And the guest experts for listening in. And then the recap of the show with bullet points, as I mentioned, is in the show notes with all the links mentioned during the interview. And if you like the podcast, please subscribe to have you here again for our next episode. So thank you and goodbye until we meet again.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Interviewers, brought to you by GuestExpertsOnAir.com.